Riley Hart watched her name detonate across the screen as a hashtag clawed up the feed, and the room shrank to a pin. The notification sound kept stabbing the air. Ava Brooke said, "Do not open the comments." Riley opened them anyway, and felt the floor tilt. Mason Cole said, "It is already trending #1. The studio hallway hummed with a low electric hiss, as if the walls knew the verdict. A clipped headline called her a fraud, a liar, a danger. Riley said, "I did not do this." The phone shook in her hand like a small animal. Jordan Pike said, "We need distance, effective now." The word distance landed like a door slamming shut in her chest. A stranger's post fed the fire, piling on with screenshots cropped like blades. Riley said, "Someone is feeding them." The lights above flickered and turned her reflection into a stranger with weary eyes. Ava said, "Stay with me. Breathe. We will find the source." A chant rose from somewhere outside, muffled but sharp, and the hashtag felt like a brand pressed against her skin. The chant outside turned into a rhythm that crawled under the skin while the feed spat more posts like sparks from a live wire. Riley said, "They want me gone before I can speak." Ava read a thread out loud, and each word cut like thin glass. Mason said, "We should post a holding note." Jordan's message arrived with corporate ice and a demand for space. Riley said, "Space from what? Me being a person." The corridor swallowed her voice and returned a colder echo. A grainy clip played, trimmed to fit a narrative, stripped of context. Ava said, "We can trace the first share if we move now." Riley remembered a laugh from last week and felt nausea at how quickly warmth could turn. The chant peaked and fell like a tide that promised to return. Somewhere a camera clicked. A call connected and brought a voice that sounded like a contract with empathy removed. Jordan said, "Until we conclude an internal review, we suspend all collaborations." Riley closed her eyes as if darkness could shelter her from the phrasing. Ava said, "We will respond with facts and timelines." The voice said, "No statements until legal clears." The floor vents whistled a tired tune. Riley said, "They want quiet while the world riots." A photo of her smile from a charity night appeared beside a headline that called her a fraud. Mason said, "That image will not help." Ava said, "Truth still lives even when drowned." Riley steadied her breathing and found a thin thread of resolve. Outside, thunder rolled like a gavel. The clip looped again and again on every screen, a fragment turned into a verdict by repetition. Riley said, "They cropped the part where I corrected it." Ava paused the frame and pointed to the missing beat. Mason said, "People will not wait for context." A message from Ethan arrived and stayed unread, a thin gray bar that felt heavier than steel. Riley said, "He will not want to be seen with me." Ava said, "He is scared, not lost." The hallway filled with the rustle of distant coats and the clack of impatient heels. Jordan said, "There's a path if you agree to step back quietly." Riley stared at the door and tasted rain. Ava said, "Or we chase the first flame and put it out." The loop stuttered and kept burning. The crowd found its tempo, and the door shivered with every chant like a drumskin. Riley said, "If I hide, they win the story." Ava said, "If you speak now, they will twist the breath from your words." Mason said, "A minute more and the tag hits a record." Jordan said, "My statement is final." Riley lifted her chin and felt the weight of her own name. A flash burned through the window and painted the wall with stark white. Ava said, "We go methodical and we go fast." Riley said, "Then we start with the truth." The door latch clicked like a countdown. Outside, the chant fell into a hush that felt sharper than noise. Riley stepped forward and did not look back. Riley sat on the edge of her unmade bed and stared at a photo pinned to the wall. It showed her on stage smiling before thousands, a frozen memory of applause that now felt cruel. Ava said, "That is who you are, not the noise outside." Riley whispered, "They will not remember this version." The room smelled of cold coffee and unopened mail stacked like silent witnesses. Mason said, "We can rebuild the image, if we map the story. Riley touched the photo and felt the paper tremble under her fingertip. Ava said, no mob owns your history. A knock at the door echoed, faint but urgent. Riley said, what if it is another betrayal in disguise? Ava said, then we answer together. The silence after the knock was louder than the sound itself. Riley sat at the kitchen table where her laughter once echoed during late-night rehearsals. Now the table was crowded with unpaid bills and clippings from magazines that once praised her name. Ava brewed coffee, the hiss of the machine filling the silence. Riley said, this place feels haunted by who I used to be. Ava slid a mug forward and said, it is still your home if you let it be. Mason appeared at the doorway holding folders filled with contracts marked void. Mason said, they erased you with a keystroke. Riley clenched her jaw and said, they cannot erase what I gave. The smell of scorched toast drifted into the air like a cruel reminder of mornings gone. Riley opened a drawer filled with journals and loose sheets inked with lyrics and confessions. She said, they will never read these words, but they were mine first. Ava leafed through a page and said, this is the truth no feed can twist. Riley smiled faintly, a ghost of her former confidence. Mason said, if people saw this side, they would know the whole picture. Riley shook her head and said, they do not want whole, they want broken. The sound of rain began to tap against the glass like fingers, asking to be let in. Ava said, every storm leaves something clean behind. Riley pressed the journal to her chest and whispered, I hope it leaves me. The hallway mirror reflected a version of Riley that felt foreign. She traced a crack in the glass and said, I look like the villain they want me to be. Ava adjusted her jacket and said, you look like someone still standing. Mason's phone buzzed with another headline. Mason said, they keep circling the same clip like vultures. Riley exhaled and said, they do not see the girl behind the stage lights. Ava placed a hand over Riley's and said, then show them the girl who survived. The mirror caught both women in the same frame, one broken, one steady, and for a moment, the line blurred. Riley sat in silence as Ethan's name lit up her phone screen. The call went unanswered, and the silence deepened like a canyon. Riley said, he cannot even say my name aloud now. Ava said, he is scared of their eyes, not yours. Riley bit her lip until it almost bled. Mason shifted uneasily and said, family silence hurts worse than public scorn. Riley stared at the vibrating phone until it stopped, leaving a blank screen like a final verdict. Ava whispered, even silence is a choice. Riley said, then he has chosen them. Her throat tightened but no tear fell, only a dry ache that felt heavier than words. Riley sat at the kitchen counter when her phone buzzed with another email. Mason read it aloud, effective immediately, your sponsorship is terminated. Riley said, they cut me without hesitation. Ava said, they never cared about you, only what you gave them. The silence felt heavy as the words lingered in the air. Riley flipped through pages of contracts that now meant nothing but shredded promises. Mason said, they are protecting themselves, not truth. Riley whispered, then, I was only ever an investment to them. Ava reached out, touched her hand and said, you are more than their headlines. The phone buzzed again. Another rejection. Another wall crumbling. Riley pressed her palms to her eyes and let the weight sink deeper. Riley scrolled her contacts and saw friends once eager for her call now leaving her unread. Ava said, they are hiding because silence is safer. Riley said, I thought they were family and all but blood. Mason said, fear makes people rewrite loyalty. Riley's thumb hovered over a name she once dialed daily, but her courage drained before pressing call. Ava whispered, do not chase their absence. Riley said, but absence screams louder than hate. Mason looked away, ashamed of how quickly allies vanished. The apartment filled with the dim hum of her phone as notifications stacked like stones burying her. Riley's face stiffened, torn between rage and grief. The echo of laughter from past nights became knives in memory. Riley's mother called, her tone sharp and trembling. She said, "You have brought shame to us." Riley's throat tightened and she replied, "You know me better than strangers online." The line fell silent before her mother said, "People talk, and we must live among them." Ava whispered, "She is afraid, not hateful." Riley said, "Her fear sounds like abandonment." Mason stood near, uncomfortable, as though hearing the fracture of something sacred. Riley closed the call before her mother did. She said, "Even my blood sees me as poison." The words hung like smoke in the air. Ava squeezed her shoulder, but the gesture could not stop the chill that spread through Riley's chest like ice cracking. The next morning brought betrayal cloaked in charm. A headline quoted Liam, her colleague, praising her downfall. Riley said, "He smiled at me last week, and now he buries me." Ava said, "He is hungry for your spot." Mason muttered, "Opportunists rise fastest when others fall." Riley stared at the article showing Liam's smug grin, his words twisting her into a villain. Riley said, "He feeds the fire so he can glow brighter." Ava said, "That glow will not last, truth burns longer." Riley slammed the paper onto the table, her hands shaking with fury. Mason said, "This will get worse before it fades." Riley whispered, "Then I will not fade with it." The notifications rolled in faster, new accusations, surfacing like waves with no end. Riley said, "They are inventing sins now." Ava said, "Outrage is fuel, and they will not stop until empty." Mason read aloud, old messages twisted out of context. Riley said, "Every whisper becomes a stone to throw." The apartment filled with a relentless chorus of pings and flashes, each one stealing another piece of her breath. Ava said, "We need to fight with proof, not silence." Riley whispered, "Proof does not trend." Mason looked at her and said, "But survival depends on it." Riley sat with her head in her hands, the sound of chaos outside matching the chaos within her chest. Riley sat in the dim glow of her laptop as Ava pulled up a thread that showed the first spark of the hashtag. Ava said, "It came from an account linked to someone you know." Riley leaned forward, heart pounding. Who would twist it like this? Mason scrolled further, his voice low, the metadata ties back to Liam. Riley's stomach dropped as if gravity betrayed her. Ava said, "He planted the seed, then watched it grow." Riley whispered, "All while pretending to support me." Mason said, "This was deliberate, not coincidence." Riley slammed the laptop shut, trembling with rage. Ava said, "The mob is loud, but betrayal from within is sharper." Riley clenched her fists and said, "Now we know where the knife came from." Riley held the printed article where Liam praised her downfall. She said, "He needed me destroyed so he could rise." Ava said, "He weaponized envy, turned your success into fuel for his ambition." Mason said, "This explains the timing, the leaks, all of it." Riley's voice cracked. "He knew the mob would feast on me." Ava said, "He wanted them to." Riley tore the article in half, the sound echoing like a scream. Mason muttered, "This is more than rivalry. It is assassination of reputation." Riley stared at the torn pieces scattered like ashes and whispered, "He is not just a rival, he is the betrayer behind it all." The outsider arrived quietly, a forgotten colleague named Claire, who once shared backstage space. Claire said, "I saw Liam edit that clip before it spread." Riley's chest tightened. "You saw him?" Claire nodded, her eyes burdened. Ava said, "Why didn't you come sooner?" Claire whispered, "I was afraid of being swallowed too." Riley said, "Your silence nearly destroyed me." Claire said, "But silence weighs heavier than truth, and I cannot carry it anymore." Mason scribbled notes, connecting timelines. Riley steadied her breath and said, "Then we have proof, finally proof." Claire's voice trembled, "Use it before it is buried." Riley replayed the hidden file Claire provided, the clip uncut, the missing seconds restored. Her voice in the video corrected the phrase before it was twisted. Riley said, This was the truth they cut away. Ava said, and Liam made sure the world never saw it. Mason said, now we have evidence of deliberate framing. Riley trembled with fury and whispered, he murdered my name with editing scissors. Ava placed a hand on her back and said, this can change the narrative. Riley said, if the mob listens. Mason said, they will not. But power brokers will. Riley's eyes burned as she stared at her own unedited voice. Riley paced the narrow apartment, anger igniting her every step. She said, they painted me guilty because it was profitable. Ava said, then we expose the architect. Mason said, we must prepare for his counterattack. Claire said, he will deny, he will smear, but this file cannot be erased. Riley's fists curled. He played God with my life, and now he must face the same light. Ava said, truth is a weapon too. Riley stopped, eyes blazing, then it is time I sharpen it. Mason closed the laptop with finality. Tomorrow, the storm shifts. Outside the city hummed, unaware a new wave was about to break. The street churned like a tide as Riley stepped into the wet air and felt the chant bite. Ava said, breathe and stay on the facts. Jordan lifted a palm and said, no statements beyond counsel. Riley said, I will speak. Mason whispered, we have timelines and the uncut file. A reporter shouted a question that bent her name like wire. Riley said, a doctored clip fueled this storm. The crowd answered with a ripple of doubt and a spark of hunger. Ava said, name the process, not the villains. Riley said, editing deleted my correction. Then a familiar hand amplified it. Jordan said, we do not accuse without a brief. Riley met the cameras and held the silence until it steadied. She said, truth is an anchor and I am done drifting. Microphones multiplied until they felt like thorns at her throat. Riley said, here is the full recording uncut. Ava held up a drive like a flare. Mason said, timestamps confirm the sequence. A heckler yelled, and a tremor of laughter moved through the line. Riley said, you do not have to like me to care about proof. Jordan said, we will circulate to legal and partners. A second question tried to corner her with rumor. Riley said, rumor is gasoline, and I will not hold the match. Ava said, review the footage, and then decide. Mason added, we can trace the first posts to a familiar network. The chant faltered as if the rain turned heavier. Riley kept her chin level and refused to blink first. Liam emerged from a town car with a smile polished for cameras. Riley watched his eyes skim the crowd like a thief sizing locks. Liam said, I stand with accountability. Ava said, then stand with evidence. Mason whispered, he is here for your stage. Riley said, did you enjoy directing the fire from the dark? Liam's jaw flexed, then softened into charm. He said, your words hurt people. Riley said, my cut words were not my words. Claire stepped from the curb and lifted her phone. Claire said, I saw you edit before the upload. The circle tightened, and the noise thinned. Liam laughed without sound, and reached for a line that would not come. Ava stepped forward and tossed the drive to a reporter whose eyes widened at the catch. Jordan said, that is not sanctioned. Ava said, silence is how lies win. Riley felt the pivot as cameras swung away from the chant and toward the file. Mason said, I emailed the uncut footage to every desk that asked for comment. Liam said, this is harassment. Claire said, this is memory rescued. Riley said, you gambled with my life and called it virtue. The rain softened into mist, and the crowd leaned in to the glow of their screens. Ava whispered, take the heat and hold the line. Riley lifted her chin and let the storm spend itself on the truth. Phones lit up with the uncut clip, and the chant turned uncertain. Riley said, listen to the part they erased. The speakers crackled as her full sentence cut through the damp air. Ava said, there it is, the missing beat. Mason said, metadata embedded, And chain verified. Liam said, anyone can forge a file. Claire said, not the timecode I recorded that night. Jordan exhaled like a man surrendering a script. Riley said, you wanted a villain and built one from scraps. The crowd did not cheer, but it blinked awake. Ava said, hold steady. Riley said, I am still here, and my name is not your toy. Thunder rolled somewhere far, and finally sounded small. The plaza emptied slowly, until silence pressed heavier than the storm. Riley sat on the steps, her hair wet, her jacket clinging to her frame. Ava said, it feels quieter now, but the damage lingers. Mason scrolled through his phone and said, half the outlets already reshaped their headlines. Riley whispered, headlines shift faster than lives. Jordan stood apart, silent, his posture stiff, a man calculating his next move. Riley said, they will move on, but I must live in what they left. Ava said, you are not erased, you are scarred. Mason looked up and said, proof never erases memory, but it changes records. Riley leaned back against the cold stone and said, then I will live as a record, not their myth. The apartment smelled of rain-soaked clothes hung to dry. Riley traced a crack in the wall, as if it were a map of her fractures. Ava said, you are still standing, that matters. Riley said, but standing feels like punishment, not strength. Mason opened his laptop and said, responses flood in, some retracting, some digging deeper. Riley muttered, they will always dig. Ava said, but not all soil grows poison. Riley turned and said, I lost trust more than reputation. Mason said, reputation can be rebuilt, trust takes longer. Riley whispered, and family silence takes forever. Ava placed her hand firmly on Riley's shoulder, grounding her in the present. Riley stood before her mirror, eyes hollow but steady. She said, this reflection is both survivor and suspect. Ava entered softly, her voice steady. You do not need to be perfect. You need to be whole. Riley said, wholeness feels impossible when pieces are scattered online. Mason appeared at the door with notes and said, pieces can be stitched into narrative. Riley said, but scars always show. Ava said, scars prove survival, not defeat. Riley touched her cheek as if expecting to see the words branded there. The mirror didn't lie, but neither did it forgive. Ava whispered, choose what you carry forward. Riley nodded slowly, fragile but resolute. A call from Ethan came at last, his voice low and uneven. He said, I was afraid to defend you. Riley said, your silence was louder than their shouts. Ethan said, I did not know how to bear the weight. Riley whispered, you chose ease over loyalty. Ava whispered to Mason, this is the wound she cannot stitch alone. Mason frowned and said, it may scar deeper than headlines. Ethan said, I want to stand with you now. Riley said, where were you when the ground caved beneath me? The silence on the line cracked but brought no comfort. Ava held Riley's arm as her eyes closed tight. Riley whispered, some bridges burn without fire, only absence. Claire sat across the table, her voice trembling as she handed over documents. Claire said, this is everything I saved, screenshots, edits, timestamps. Riley said, you risk everything by sharing this. Claire said, I risked more by staying silent. Ava said, this closes the loop, it is undeniable. Mason examined the files and said, chain of custody intact, admissible. Riley whispered, then the truth breathes at last. Claire said, I hope it frees you. Riley said, freedom is not forgiveness, but it is a start. Ava smiled faintly and said, you are not alone in this storm anymore. Riley exhaled, a sound between relief and grief. The storm had broken, but the wreckage remained. The city woke indifferent, while Riley watched the feed slow to a crawl. Ava said, some outlets corrected, most just softened the sting. Mason said, retractions live small, outrage lives loud. Jordan hovered near the door and said, partners are reviewing positions. Riley said, "They review me like a broken product." Claire texted a simple, "Here if needed," and it landed like a lifeline. Ava said, "You did not win a crowd, you won a truth." Riley said, "Truth is quieter and heavier, but it stays." Mason said, "We build forward from weight, not from noise." Jordan said, "If you choose to return, we will stage it right." Riley breathed in and felt the air stop hurting. Riley walked past a cafe where her poster once hung, now replaced by a new face. She said, "They moved on between sips." Ava said, "They always do, but some stayed." Mason said, "I keep reading messages from people who watch the full cut." Riley said, "A handful of candles in a storm." Jordan said, "A handful is enough to see the road." Claire sent another link proving the chain and said, "Use it, even if no one cheers." Riley touched the empty space on the wall and smiled without warmth. Ava said, "Leave room for a new image." Riley said, "I will not beg for walls anymore." The theater stood dark, except for a ghost light on stage. Riley said, "This used to feel like a door opening." Ava said, "It can be a door again, even if smaller." Mason said, "We booked a streamed set, limited seats, no press list." Riley said, "A voice without megaphones can still travel." Claire said, "I will be in row 3, quiet and loud all at once." Jordan said, "Security is tight, exits mapped, questions screened." Riley touched the mic stand and felt the metal cool and honest. Ava said, "Speak the whole sentence this time." Riley nodded and let the silence rehearse with her. The small crowd held its breath as Riley stepped into the cone of light. She said, "I do not need your forgiveness to tell the truth." Ava said, "Take your time." Mason gave a tiny nod like a downbeat. Jordan stayed in the wings, ready to absorb any blowback. Claire lifted her phone, not for virality, but for record. Riley said, "They cut my words and sold the wound." The room did not clap. It listened. Ava said, "Keep going." Riley said, "I am still here, and here's what I meant." Her voice steadied like a bridge built as she walked. When the set ended, no anthem rose, just quiet shaped like respect. Riley said, "I cannot fix every mind I never met." Ava said, "You were not made to." Mason said, "We archived everything, receipts and breath." Jordan said, "Some partners will return, some never will." Claire said, "You have a map now, and it points forward." Riley looked at the mic, and then at the door the crowd used to flood. She said, "I will leave it open even if only the wind visits." Ava smiled like sunrise learning to stand. Riley stepped off the stage and said the line that would not unring.